Okay, so something I really want to do is teach history, and especially history about the place where I'm from, because I really think Utah is a great place, and I really think it has a lot of rich history. And one of the skills or things I really want my students to know is, what really makes this place great. But a skill I would say would be how to really think about why things happen, and maybe if they were there at that time, how would they have handled things? Because it's very, very popular today to get really critical of history. So a lot of us, when we think of Utah, and the history of Utah, we think of the pioneers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I myself am a descendant of those pioneers, but a lot of us don't quite think about that there were other people here and other people who explored this area before the pioneers got here in 1847. So, a lot of tribes, a lot of Native American tribes, were actually here in the state of Utah. The five main tribes that were in the state is the Goshutes, the Shoshone, the Navajo, the Ute, and the Paiute. And the Ute tribe is probably the biggest tribe here in the state of Utah. Where they were was around the Salt Lake, Eastern Utah area, and Provo area. When we hear about Mount Timpanogos, that originates from the Timpanogos Utes. And when we think of the University of Utah, um, we know that their mascot is the Utes. And so the Ute tribe really does have a big part to play in our culture in the state of Utah. The Navajo is around the southeastern Four Corners area. The Goshu is around Tooele, Box Elder, well, maybe Tooele, like western Box Elder and Millard County area. And the Shoshone is northern Utah, southern Idaho. So Cache Valley, the Native American tribes that were here, would have been from the Shoshone tribe. And so there were also trappers that got here, who explored this area. Father Escalante, um, and Dominguez. They were explorers that discovered parts of southern Utah and up into Provo. And then there's also famous trappers and fur traders like Jim Bridger and Jedediah Smith and Peter Skeet Ogden, who discovered areas of this northern western state. And really, there's even a tale of Jim Bridger who thought he discovered the ocean when in reality that was the Great Salt Lake. So, like I said, the pioneers still had a big part to play, and they got here in 1847. And they came here after they fled what is known as the Midwestern area of the U.S. from religious persecution. Their what they would call their first prophet, Joseph Smith, he was killed in Illinois. And so their next prophet, Brigham Young, at the time, led a huge expedition out west. He is sometimes nicknamed as the American Moses. And here's just some fun pictures of the pioneers coming into the Great Salt Lake Valley and just them on the plains. And, a lot of them really suffered a lot of hardships coming across, and a lot of them died, and they really held on to, or they really believed what they were doing was from God. And so that's what some of them in their journals claimed kept them going to make it to what they would call Zion. So even though they fled, um, sorry about that, even though they fled religious persecution, um, that didn't mean the U.S. government and them still had their quarrels. So in 1858, Johnson's army, and Johnson was a U.S. general. He came to Utah because there was a lot of tension between the leaders in Utah and the U.S. government. A lot of people in the U.S. government had a huge problem with polygamy. And what polygamy is that is when there's a marriage between one man and more than one woman. And that was a big part of the culture of those pioneer settlers. And there was just that huge clash there. And so one thing that the pioneers did in Nauvoo and in Ohio was they built something called a temple, and they believed it to be very similar to what Old Testament temples would be if you ever get a chance to read the Old Testament in the Bible. And so they actually had to bury what is known as the Salt Lake Temple today, which is really the center of Salt Lake City. And Johnson's army came through, and it was just really bizarre because the pioneers were really, really skeptical of outsiders because they were sick of getting driven from homes. And so they were really skeptical of this army. And so when they came through Salt Lake, it would have not been a busy, busy place. And that's them marching through. That's Johnson's army marching through. But the pioneers and church members were not the only citizens of Utah. By all means, they were a big part of the population. But there were some people who left the church. And there were some people who were critical about the church's political stances on things, and they were very critical of polygamy. That was probably the biggest hot topic issue. And a lot of church leaders told a lot of their members to be very skeptical of the government, and were kind of critical of U.S. government leaders. And so, and they had their newspaper, because at the time newspapers were the big thing to get around, but something called the Salt Lake Tribune was started in response to church leaders, and people who started the Salt Lake Tribune really disagreed with church leaders' views on things, and so they decided to give another perspective on their side of the story. And even today, there's still a rivalry of, you have the really conservative Deseret News that is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then you have the Salt Lake Tribune, who many people would consider them to be a more liberal paper. And it's just really interesting in the state of Utah to kind of see that clash. And so a big part of government and a big case were these Edmunds-Tucker Acts. And in 1882, the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act was signed, and that made polygamy illegal, and that was a big part of a lot of people's lives in Utah. At the time, it was really hard for women to gain property. Women didn't really have as much rights back then. And so a lot of these women, it was very much women relied on their husbands for financial needs. And I'm not saying there's not some marriages like that today, by all means there are. But it was really, really, really much women were really relying on their husband for financial support. And then it would get reciprocated too, as men were really, really relying on women to take care of the kids and take care of the home and take care of the chores around the house, which would be taking care of the home. So it was just a different time back then. But this making this illegal, then that really, not all, but some polygamous families really felt like that hurt them. And in 1887, the U.S. government really cracked down on more polygamy stuff and just more Utah laws. This was right after this wasn't too much after the Civil War, and the Republicans, who at the time were mainly the ones who were abolitionists, they saw polygamy as enslavement of women. So how they were fighting for African American rights, they also thought these women were enslaved, and they thought what they were doing was really helping them out. But interestingly, most women in diary accounts and journal accounts will tell you, in their own accounts, not all, but most, will say that what they were doing is they thought polygamy was the right thing to do. And so it's just really interesting to see those perspectives. But Also, it's really important to know that in 1896, Utah was granted statehood on January 4th, and that was a big deal. And it's one of the newer states omitted to the U.S. But sadly, 46 years later, Executive Order 9066 was signed. And a lot of people may say, well, Utah, they're a small state. Like, yeah, they probably had some people drafted during World War II, but like, I mean, did they really have a big part to play? But there's actually a lot of sad things in U.S. history um, that Utah did have a big part to play in it. So on February 19th, 1942, the U.S. was Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And what that was is it was saying that people of Japanese descent were to be relocated to camps in the West. And these weren't the same as Nazi camps, but they were still very bad, and there were still Japanese people that were mistreated. It was not just a nice little relocation resort that they were going to. They were forced to leave their homes, and even before they were forced to leave their homes, there were many prejudices against them after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And I could go into more details on that. But there was a big camp called Camp Topaz, and that's about 30-45 minutes west of Delta. That's where my dad's from, and so I've had the privilege of going out there. There's not much out there, but there is a museum in Delta, and this really got a lot of Japanese people actually out in the state of Utah. I know my grandpa went to school with someone, and the reason why his family was in Utah was because of this. And after World War II, they were released, but that didn't change their lives completely. There were still prejudices against them, and even today, there's still prejudice against Japanese people. Um, but even though that's really sad, some really great things in Utah is in 2002, there were the Olympics. And this was a big economic boost for Utah. This really put Utah on the map. Many buildings today that we see, so Rice-Eccles Stadium, where the University of Utah plays, they have that big torch, and that's where that was lit. Um, where the Grizzlies play hockey, that was used for certain events. The Olympic Oval in Kearns was also used. And it's not, well, it was called the Delta Center when I was growing up. Now it's called the Vivint Smart Home Arena. But that was used for many figure skating areas. And so Utah is just this great place that a lot of people now go to ski. And a lot of Winter Olympian athletes, even today, will train in areas of Park City. And so Utah has a rich history. It's got its ups, it's got its downs, but it's full of people that work really, really hard and always help each other out. And it's just the best, my personal bias, best state in the world. But yeah, there's its rich history.